This is Jim Soper with Ballots for Bernie. I am talking live with Jan BenDor from the Michigan Election Reform Association. Uh,
Alliance.
Alliance, sorry. We are going to be talking about the recounts in Michigan and with some time also about the history of recounts in Michigan and around the country. But we're going to start with Michigan because it is in the news and it's become an important topic. Jen, just give us very briefly 1 minute of history of what MIRA is about and what your connection is with them, and then we're going to start into talking about elections in Michigan.
Sure. Well, thank you, Jim. The Michigan Election Reform Alliance actually incorporated in 2006, but we started in 2004 after the debacle of the Ohio presidential election, when many of our people had gone to Ohio to volunteer in what they thought would be a recount there. And they came back pretty fired up to look into what was going wrong at home. At that time, I was deputy clerk of a large urban township. I'd been an accredited election administrator for 16 years, and I had been through the disaster of 2000 and seen the nightmare of the HAVA money going to horrible machines that we didn't want. So we were pretty aware of election integrity issues at that point. We formed the Michigan Election Reform Alliance. We put together a legislative reform plan. And since that time, we have been doggedly working our plan, which includes post-election audits, risk-limiting statistical audits. We have been working on just a whole list of reforms, that everything from voting rights to constitutional rights. We've branched out into working on redistricting. So we have a pretty broad number of election-related purposes.
Okay. You've been at it a long time and covering a lot of territory. Let's start with more recent Michigan history. You were telling me about elections in Detroit. What went on there?
Well, we had a horror take place in this state with the election of Governor Rick Snyder, who is one of the worst governors in the country. He was part of the 2010 takeover, and he immediately passed, within 2 months of his taking office, an Emergency Manager Act, which allowed the state to go and just literally take over cities and school districts that they decided were not up to snuff economically. Well, 2010, as you know, was 2 years into the Depression. Cities all over the state were having problems. But Detroit was not in any way in serious trouble. The main problem they had was a pension underfunding. And but, you know, pretty soon African American cities were falling like flies. And what that meant was that the citizens had no right to vote for their local office holders. They could elect them, but then the office holders had absolutely no power. So we knew our democracy was in trouble. And so leading up to 2013, which was a mayoral election in Detroit, right before the city was due to go through a bankruptcy trial, which it never deserved or needed. And we suspected that hanky-panky was already in place. A man who was not even a resident of Detroit, who was white, running for mayor in an 84% African-American city that already seems a little sketchy. It was. And he was from a community right outside Detroit called Livonia, which is all Republican. And you have Detroit, an all Democratic city. That election was one fraud after another. We trained challengers. We had witnesses. We documented the fraud. We could get no law enforcement to do anything. We went through a recount. Time and time again, we were denied at the recount. The people who did this were primarily the candidates who were the legitimate candidates. So we were already on alert that anything that was going to happen after 2013 was going to be a nightmare. And not to pick on Detroit, we had 3 other cities with similar issues: corruption, because of corporate takeovers of these cities, not because of the residents. The media love to blame black people. And so coming into the primary season this year, we were braced for the worst. And there were a number of other predictors. We knew from Mira's own research that our 14-year-old tabulators were all dilapidated and falling apart. And we actually published a report in January of 2014 that said, facing Michigan's election cliff, the steep costs of failing tabulators. And what we had was exactly what we predicted 2 years ago. Massive tabulator failures. This means long lines. You've got to fix it, or you got to replace it while people are standing there. This is no way to run a pop stand. And we had tried to get a bill through that would have put in place a process for a blue ribbon commission to get, just like Colorado did. They studied all the different ways they could count their votes. What would be the best, the most trusted? Well, we wanted a 2-year study here, and if that had been done, we wouldn't be where we were this year with a nightmare election.
Which were the cities that were also being affected by the election problems? Besides
Flint, Pontiac, out on the west side, the Allegan County, the cities in Allegan County, the cities in Berrien County. These cities had clusters of migrant people, African Americans, all of them losing their rights, and it's still pretty much that way. The emergency managers are limited to 2 years. Most of them left the cities in worse shape than when they took them over.
So they're focusing on minority communities? Absolutely,
they picked on them because when you look at these older cities, there are many things of value in these cities. They have infrastructure. They have water. Water is a commodity, as you know. They have lighting systems. They have land. Flint has land that's slated for fracking. So the idea was the corporations would take over these cities, drive the people out, literally drive the people out. Detroit has lost 250,000 people. And I can tell you where they are. A lot of them are sleeping on the beach in Santa Monica right now. I've run into them. I run into them in Eureka. And people have nowhere to go. It's an internal U.S. migration crisis that nobody's talking about.
And they could have been voting in Michigan if they hadn't stopped.
They would have been voting in Michigan up until 2010. Detroit was a reliable Democratic stronghold.
Okay, Jen, give us a website where people can go to get this information. Do you have one?
Well, our reports are published at the Michigan Election Reform Alliance.org website. We also have manuals. People can see how we've done our own post-election audits using photography. We've actually calculated the error rate of the tabulators from this study. We have one study called Are Michigan's Elections Trustworthy? And we answer that question, not. We've tried to share what we've learned. We have a lot of kits there. We have all of our legislation and our proposals is there, and our legislative plan, so you can see what we've done.
This is MichiganElectionReform.org, you said?
MichiganElectionReformAlliance.org.
.org.
All one word.
All one word. Okay, let's go into November now. We've already getting the picture that things are fairly corrupt in Michigan, something similar, not exactly the same history, but a background similar to Wisconsin. And let's get into November. Did you see already in the run-up this fall to the election things happening to shift the election?
We didn't see any signs of drastic shifting. I don't think anybody was looking for what would, of course, eventually explain all that. I don't think most white people in the Midwest or even in Michigan were aware of the population drain that's taken place in the state and how it was concentrated in certain places. So, Michael Moore predicted that Trump would win, and no one else did, and no one else believed him. But Michael Moore lives in Flint. He knew exactly what's been going on. Flint has had a terrible population loss. Over half of the people in Flint have gone.
His first film was about Flint, basically.
That's right.
And the attack on the people of Flint. Okay, so we get to Election Day, and Mr. Trump is the nominal winner there, and you started to see results. What was raising red flags?
The red flags immediately had to do with the number of provisional ballots that voters were being given. The emphasis in this state has always been on avoiding provisional ballots. They're a joke. They were forced on us by the Federal Help America Vote Act, but they're pretty meaningless. And clerks in this state, and by the way, we have a unique election system. Our elections are controlled by local clerks, city and township clerks. There are 1,500 of them. And as such, these people are very, very proud of their work. They're very independent. And they try to get voters to where they need to be, and to cast a regular ballot. So provisional ballots are just definitely not a thing here. And when you see large numbers of provisional ballots, then you know there's something really wrong. Somebody has been messing with voter registrations. And I started hearing from friends in Detroit of many people being turned away on Election Day. My phone was ringing off the hook. People who'd been registered for years, all of a sudden, they're not. Something very crazy was going on, and we're actually still investigating that because the recount provided absolutely no insight into that problem at all. We've had to clash with our Secretary of State before. One of our reports on our website is about the Michigan purge that was an attempted voter purge. We caught our Secretary of State carrying out what was, we documented a Karl Rove request. Rove was trying to clear out all of the battleground states for the 2008 election, and they were going to purge 1 million voters. Now, that's illegal in Michigan. The only person who can cancel a voter is that local clerk, that city or township clerk. No one else is a legal person. So for that to take place at the state level is completely illegal under state law. And we stopped them. We got the help. I have to give a lot of credit to the Advancement Project in Washington. They're fierce fighters. They've got lawyers. We had to go and get Uncle Vinny to help us, and they did. And the state backed down, and they will not, they will not admit to doing any purging now because they were caught at it. So we're very curious about how did all those voters get removed from the voting list. This is very interesting. And I think, again, we're going to look to Karl Rove because he was the master in this whole thing.
How many voters are we talking about with the provisionals?
Well, we're not aware of the numbers yet because the state doesn't publish them. It's public information, but they keep it very cleverly hidden. I've got a whole bunch of volunteers that are starting to work on that now to collect those reports. But we expect to find a very high number.
Would this be connected to interstate cross-check?
Yes.
Yes. Was reporting on in his fabulous film, The Best Democracy Money Can Buy. Is that
well, we confronted the state about that. We've confronted them for the last 3 years, well before Palast was writing about this. We knew about cross-check. And in every time we have inquired if they're using it, they swear they are only using it to dedupe driver licenses with other states.
Yeah, but they weren't.
So we're finding out about that. But at any rate, that's one of the things that went wrong. We have the expectation that a lot of other things are going to go wrong because the machines were expected to break down. We also expected that there would be a whole lot of just administrative problems. Elections have become incredibly complicated, way more than normal humans can do, thanks to the stupidity of electronic vote counting. And so there's so many places where you can make mistakes. We've had a massive retirement of our experienced election staff. In a general election for every precinct, you really have to have at least 12 to 14 people per precinct to administer a proper election. And when your knowledgeable people have quit, they've retired, they've burned out, then you have a real hole. And people just, they're not going to remember all these details. As an election administrator, the way I handled that was I gave people a step-by-step checklist from the time they arrived at 6 in the morning to the time they left, which could be 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, everything they had to do. And they were expected to just go down that checklist. They didn't have to think, just do this, do this, do this. And it worked very well because then people didn't have to remember stuff. There would be 1 or 2 people who would kind of have the overview. And we managed to have, very well organized and orderly elections. And at the end of the night, all of our numbers would balance. The number of people showing up to vote and the number of ballots counted would match. That's a key thing. And a lot of other, auditing type things that you do to make a credible election. So by the end of the night, you should have all that stuff right. Well, if you don't get it right, you've got another layer of protection, which is called a receiving board. And these people are intent on getting any mistakes caught that were made by the first group. That all goes then to the county clerk and the county board of canvassers. And the day after the election, they go through all the precincts in the county and try to make sure that everybody didn't make mistakes. If someone does, they're brought in to fix it. The canvassers aren't going to fix it. So by the end of this whole sequence, you should have a pretty good quality control over your election. Well, this recount showed that's not happening. That's absolutely not happening. And when you've got half of the precincts in the entire city of Detroit that are a hot mess, an ungodly mess, with missing ballots, missing numbers not balancing, even if you assume that everybody had good intentions, which I don't, you have, this is not a credible election. This is not democracy when you got an election that's in disarray like this. And that's what we saw. Now, we also think that there was hanky-panky going on, but we're in the process of trying to prove it. It's very difficult. We could not get the information out of the recount that really gave us the help we needed to see what was going on. The biggest thing that we saw, and you've probably seen this mentioned, is the number of ballots that had no vote for president. Most people, go to vote for president. If they vote for anybody else, it's great, but that's what they're there for. You don't expect to see very many ballots with President blank. This election, the state of Michigan had 75,000, by the state's own number, 75,000 ballots that had no vote for president. Trump won by a little over 10,000. And so you have to ask, well, what's going on there? This is really not normal. And immediately, that's a suspicious condition. You have to look at, were there funny things going on with the programming of the memory cards that run the counting inside a tabulator? That would be very easy to do in the state because out of 83 counties, 80 of them use a private tech company allied with one of the 3 voting tabulator manufacturers. And these tech companies are not sworn officials, and they program how the votes are going to be counted. And
stop you there because I've heard of this in other states. You're talking about a tech company that is not one of the major system vendors, and is not your public election officials, but some other company on the side that
they're affiliated with the big vendors. In other words, the big vendors subcontract the programming.
What do they do?
My county programs their own. They don't trust these guys. I mean, we have some counties that have some real ethical positions. There are 3 counties that program their own memory cards, but others don't bother, or they don't have the staff. And so we're actually our elections have been outsourced to these private contractors.
This is something that John Brakey's been digging up in Arizona, and I want to clarify for our viewers here, when we're talking about programming memory cards, each voting machine or each scanner has to know what the ballot is that they're scanning or that the people are voting with. It becomes what's called a ballot definition file, and that file lists who the candidates are in which races for that machine. And that's called programming the ballot card. And that's what these private companies, about which we know almost nothing.
Right. And they're not sworn. They're not sworn to uphold the Constitution or the laws. There's no accountability for these people.
They'll claim they have fiscal responsibility to their owners, and that's it.
No consequences for them.
Consequences. So they're sending this information out, and if viewers want to search for the phrase fraction magic, they will get an idea of what kind of subversive power these people, unseen power these people have.
That's right.
Being able to fiddle with the vote counts on these machines from one central place, from a private little job shop that nobody knows anything about. The other thing that's striking me here, you said you had how many townships and so on running this election in Michigan?
Well, we have about 1,500 local units that are running elections. Now, that's a strength. That is a strength, because if you were going to rig an election centrally, it would be almost impossible. But it's not as strong as it should be, because you've got a lot of them using these same private contractors. That's the breakdown. That is the essential breakdown. And there's no oversight. Nobody is checking what code they're putting in. Nobody.
We have in California 58 counties that run the show here. We already talked about 58 county chaos in California. You're talking about 1,500 township chaos, and that's just mind-boggling.
It's not chaotic. I have a lot of respect for the people who do run these local elections. They are very patriotic for the most part. These are the little blue-haired ladies that we trust our elections to. They don't know how they've been undermined. They have no clue how their efforts at running honest elections have been sabotaged by this corporate election system, which we've been stuck with since Bob Ney and the Help America Vote Act.
Well, when we're talking about 58 county chaos here, is because we have 58 rule books in California. So I can go 10 miles north into the next county and expect to see the election conducted the same way. They're using different machines. They do it differently. And even if you go across San Francisco Bay, they're using the same machine from Sequoia, and they do it differently. So it's chaotic. And in June, when people asked me to say, how do we observe stuff, I had to point, first of all, to find your county rule book, county procedures, and how to do it. Start there, because I couldn't tell them. I don't know how they do it in 58 counties. John Brakey reports that from Arizona, they have one rule book for the whole state. Arizona is a small state, but it's something that we need to be working for, is to consolidate the rules so that people, observers can know, they can go from one county to the next, and hopefully later from one state to the next, to know what to expect and know what the rules are. And this is part of the problem that is coming out in spades, as we are looking at Florida, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Nevada, and they all have different rule books and different systems, and we're trying to recount them, and it's, again, chaos. Jimmy Carter will not observe elections in the United States because he doesn't know what the rules are.
Well, he says we lack any kind of rational system. We don't meet the criteria of the Carter Center.
Yeah, so no, we can't do this. Okay, let's go back to the fun stuff. The election and the recount. Um, what did you see coming out of Detroit? What was raising red flags in Detroit now? Aside from a lot of provisionals, but what else? There was significant things happening there.
Well, hearing from people who had been to the polls, who were shocked at how disorganized the precincts were. And, just like precincts all over this state, for many years we had longtime election workers. They were very competent. They were very well organized. And all of a sudden, it was just a mess. You had new people who didn't know what they were doing. You didn't even have a precinct chair who was very knowledgeable. It was a very shocking situation for a lot of longtime voters who expected to go into their precinct and see an orderly situation. And it was made even worse with the tabulators breaking down, which was, as I've said, a predicted phenomenon. It could have been prevented had the state taken proactive measures, and nothing happened on that level. So this was a slow motion wreck. And what the aborted recount did, actually the recount got about halfway through the ballots in a lot of areas, but it showed us that we were in a slow motion train wreck. This whole election was a train wreck. And it grieves me greatly because, in the 50s through about the 80s, Michigan had a highly respected election system. It was counted in, the top 5 in the country for transparency, accuracy, and honesty.
Jen, one point of clarification. When you're talking about tabulators, I have in my head something that's sitting in the county headquarters. And out in the precincts, we're talking about voting machines, touchscreen machines, and scanners. What are you referring to when you're saying tabulators?
Tabulators are the scanners. They are optical scan tabulators. That's what they're called. Diebold, ES&S, and Sequoia were the brands that Michigan bought in 2003 and 4. It's another horror story about how that all went down. Diebold, of course, has changed its name 3 times, and it's now part of Dominion Systems. Don't you like that name? Dominion is a company headquartered in Toronto. So that's one outsource all the way to another country. Sequoia at one point was owned by the country of Venezuela. Sequoia got sold, and eventually, things happened there. ES&S has continued as a company. They were trying to buy everybody up, but fortunately, the Justice Department stopped them because they were creating a monopoly. The new machines aren't much different from the old ones. The old ones were 1970s computer junk. The memory cards still only have about 256K. And when was the last time you heard of anything with that little amount of memory?
About 20 years ago. I did a report on a Dominion system that was submitted for review in California. You'll find it on my webpage, countedascast.org. Look on the left side, and the interface to that was the worst interface I have seen to computer systems since the 80s. So it was not very impressive, but we don't need to stay there.
The programming is in BASIC, by the way. BASIC, computer language.
Basic what?
Basic computer language. It's still in BASIC. Any 6th grader learned to do that.
Language which violates federal regulations. And so they shouldn't be doing that. We went through that 10 years ago.
But we're still stuck with them.
Yeah, well, wonderful. What brought about this shift? You said in Detroit there was a shift in how well the elections were being run. What brought that about?
Well, the election of Janice Winfrey as city clerk, everybody had great hopes for her because she was supposedly, going to bring more transparency and honesty to her office. Well, it turns out she was just in the pocket of the corporate interests who intended to take over the city of Detroit, and they have. They have bought everything. They've privatized everything in the city. They've stolen the city's assets. They stole its magnificent water and sewer system, which was the single best system in the United States, with the best urban, water you could ever get, taken from the pure water of Lake Huron, one of the Great Lakes. And the lighting system is gone. A beautiful Belle Isle Park, which is just a landmark. All of the city's assets have now been privatized. And this is a theft of billions of dollars from a municipality. And this is the theft of taxpayers' long-time investments. That's why you cheat in elections. You cheat in elections because you want to steal things that are valuable. You're not going to cheat in a school board election where nobody even gets paid to go to the meetings. You're going to cheat when there are billions of dollars at stake. That's why Detroit was a target.
When I was a child, I grew up in Wisconsin, by the way, and when I was a child, Detroit was a jewel of the Midwest, and this is no longer true.
It still is in little places. There are little places that escaped the maw of the monster.
Well, I hope to come out there and visit with you sometime. Let's go to, you mentioned that the Michigan election law was misinterpreted. Can you give us the standard interpretation and then what you think is the correct interpretation?
Well, since 2000, actually since 2002, with the advent of Terry Lynn Land as Secretary of State. Terry Lynn Land is from the west side of Michigan and part of the Richard DeVos wing of the far right of the Republican Party. And you may have heard of DeVos's wife, Betsy, who has been nominated to be Secretary of Education. So Richard DeVos is like a mini Koch brother. His dad made the money from Amway. And so since 2002, we have had a far right-wing Secretary of State, and they decided to weaken the election system so they could control Michigan more directly. We had two pillars of honesty and integrity in our election system that it was brilliantly designed in the 50s by people who knew something. At the front end of every election, we had an election commission that was responsible for making sure that however you voted, that device was in good repair, in good working order, it was trustworthy, had been tested. They also were to supply the ballots to make sure the ballots were all correct and proofread. They were to supply all the other supplies like seals to seal up things securely. So that was at the front end of the process. And then at the back end of the process were the boards of canvassers, and they were the last bastion of security for elections. The board of canvassers was 2 Republican appointees and 2 Democratic appointees. And their job was to make sure that at the end of the election, everything had been done correctly and honestly. And if there were problems, they would independently hold recounts to make sure that everybody was satisfied that the election was honest and correct. Well, they had police power. When you petitioned for a recount, it said right on the petition, mistake or fraud. The reason for my petition is mistake or fraud. So basically, you were making a police report. And no candidate asks for a recount unless they suspect something weird, because the election came out differently than what they really expected. And most candidates pretty well know how their election's going to come out. So as a result of that, the law provided that a board of canvassers had police power. They could subpoena witnesses. The recount was to be documented by a court reporter. Any challenges were to be part of the record. You could swear in and subpoena witnesses. You could hire investigators and experts. And at the end of this, if there was evidence, you would turn that over to the county prosecutor because a crime had occurred. And that's even in the mistake category. Mistakes happen often when people are not upholding their duty. So that's neglect. That's malfeasance. So it was a very strict standard, and that was a good thing. Starting in 2002, the boards of canvassers were told, oh, don't bother your pretty little heads about that part. We're just here to count the paper. In fact, what the other part of the law says is that the recount is supposed to examine everything. Memory cards, the ballot boxes, the blank ballots that are left over, are there supposed to be more than that? What happened to the rest of the blank ballots? Everything is part of the investigation, not just the ballots counting what's on the paper. That was only part of the recount. But the secretaries of state convinced people, and they talk in very officious tones, and the press buys whatever they say, that the law didn't say what it said. So we get to 2016, and Jill Stein files for a statewide recount, and her lawyers are told, well, you can only recount precincts where everything is perfect, where the seal is still there, and the number on the seal matches the poll book, and all this other nitpicky stuff. That is not what the law says. The law says you're supposed to recount everything. And if there's a broken seal or numbers that are discrepant, you're supposed to investigate and find out why, because maybe somebody should go to prison. And all of this has just been a total fiasco. It's a lie that there was a recount in this state. It was not a recount according to Michigan election law. And I've vetted, it isn't just my interpretation. The law is very plain. You can read it yourself and you'll say, yeah, that's what that means. But I've run this by a lot of attorneys, and they've all said, nobody's ever read this. That is what it says. And I was part of a recount in 2000 before the takeover, where we did go through everything and determined why certain things, were sort of slightly off, and ultimately counted every single ballot, no matter what container it had been in. There were even ballots that were counted that had been overlooked on election night because somebody forgot them in the back of a clerk's car. They were absentee ballots that got forgotten. And as long as the investigation showed they had not been compromised, no one had access to them, they had been in a vault, they were counted too. And in a congressional recount, where the difference was 100 votes, which is very close, all of the ballots were counted, and I was there. I saw it, and it was the way it should have been done.
So you were saying that the law never was changed from its original?
Never been changed. It's still there. It's just been ignored purposefully to distort the process.
Do you have any idea, because you're saying that Jill Stein's lawyers have been, to use one word, hornswoggled into accepting this? Do you have any idea how they pulled that off or what's going on?
Well, I can tell you that the Stein campaign hired the wrong lawyer. I won't go into that, but the lawyer they hired has a terrible record. I actually got I had a tiny opportunity to make a recommendation, which I did, and my recommendation was ignored. And they hired the wrong legal team. Had they hired a better legal team, that team would have told them, don't get schnockered. Don't spend money on a worthless recount. Insist on the real thing.
I just gave money to recountnow.org. I gave it today because seeing what's going on in the background, I'm seeing who was sending in the real long-time knowledgeable election advocates like you, like John Brakey, like some people who I won't name yet into Nevada. And these are the people who have an idea what's really going on. And I don't want to say that Jill Stein isn't doing the right thing in Michigan. It looks like they may have fumbled the ball. For Recount Now, I know they're sending in very good people, so I just gave them what for me is a largest donation, recountnow.org. The recounts are sort of over, but this is a good place to send some money because this is really what we need now.
But don't engage in a recount unless the rules are going to produce a real recount. And that means, in addition, an investigation of suspicious things. If there are a lot of blank ballots coming in from absentee voters, there's something wrong there. I personally observed at the recount site in Detroit, precinct after precinct, where there were blank absentee votes. Well, absentee voters aren't going to spend 68 cents to send in a blank ballot. Nobody does that. In 16 years, I've never seen that. Something very bizarre is going on. There are all kinds of suspicious things that we've seen that are really unprecedented. And this was not a recount. This was a crime.
It smells like it, and the part of the crime's not the word I'm using. Stonewalling. The stonewalling is that we can't go find out. We can't dig into it. That by itself smells. Was there other evidence in some of the precincts and some of the recount activity of people trying to cover up or to stonewall what was going on there? The stonewalling actions.
Well, by insisting that many precincts could not be recounted because there were, a discrepancy of one ballot between what was physically stacked and what had been put in the poll book, that's stonewalling. That's a cover-up. When you will not let a recount go forward under normal conditions of a slight error, and you all you have to do is investigate, and you can see that at 1 a.m, these people were tired and they made an arithmetic mistake. It happens in a lot of places. So that's a stonewall. It was a stonewall when they would not let the observers count the ballots that were stacked in the other category. The way that the counting went, there was a stack for Trump, there was a stack for Clinton, there was a stack for Stein, there were stacks for 2 other party candidates, and then they had a stack for other. And that's where they lumped in those undervoted ballots, the blank ballots, which were also counted as undervotes. You had write-in ballots, you had overvoted ballots, all in one big stack. And in some places, they didn't even bother to count that stack. So now how are you going to reconcile the count you've just done of the other 5 if that 6th stack is never reported? All kinds of shenanigans like that. That's basic accounting 101. You count everything.
You should count everything. I'm going to include in here a colleague that you met this past week, Richard Chan. Can you shift over here, Richard?
Hey, Richard.
Hi, Jan.
And Richard is a member of the Voting Rights Task Force here in California. And he and another member went out to Michigan to look at the recount. And he's sitting right next to me. Richard, what did you see out there? What took your notice?
Well, my second day there, we dealt with one 2-bag entity that had 5 precincts in it, and only 2 of the 5 were counted because the other 3 were off by 1 or 2 votes, which to me is absurd. I mean, the ones you want to count most are the ones where you find a discrepancy. You don't want to find the ones that perfectly match the count. Well, you want to count them too, but you don't want to purposely leave out any ones that may be off. That's nuts. I couldn't believe that.
What about there's an official who saw something?
Oh, there was a lady we bumped into who said that she's. I don't know if you want this on the internet yet.
let's not do
We
it.
probably shouldn't go into this, Richard, because
Right.
you know we haven't had a chance to really
Right.
delve into it.
Right.
But you have someone identified who possibly witnessed a very serious crime
Yeah.
during the recount. During the recount.
Right.
Let's leave it at that. You're right. Let's leave it at that. It caught
Right.
my attention as something that we're going to need to pursue.
Right. I just want to back up everything Jan's been saying, because it was a facade recount. It had all the appearances of a recount that is in name only, I would say, because so much was not counted. They wouldn't let us look at the books where the names were. They wouldn't let us look in the back of the book to see the seal numbers, to see if they were changed. They wouldn't let us look at the tape, the tabulator tape for the numbers. It was all those parts of it were trust us, and even the great sage Ronald Reagan said, trust but verify, and so it was a Potemkin village of recounts.
Well said. Well said.
Yeah, well said.
Okay.
Jan, let's go back here. First of all, we are trying to take a look at comments. You can leave comments, and if we have some questions for Jan, we'll try to get them in. You talked to me earlier. By the way, also somebody also noted that this undervoting, the blank ballots, is not just an issue in Michigan, but was basically across much of the country. It's one of the big questions we have. Why were people voting but not voting? And I will bring up an issue that's started becoming more clear to me this summer, something that Bev Harris mentioned some things 10 years ago. Again, going back to these private shops that are helping the election officials. And there are people with dubious past that are working on vote by mail projects, where they help the county to send out ballots. And what became clear is that these operations can get the names, the address, birthdays, and signatures. And they're getting blank ballots, they're getting blank envelopes, and saying, here, please send out the vote by mail ballots. And this sets an opportunity up for what I call signature, automated forgery, where they could print up the envelopes because they have the signatures. They can print up the envelopes, and then they can connect that with the fact that parties are now running vote by mail operations or get out the vote operations. And people call up and say, oh, have you voted today? And if the person says, no, I'm not going to vote, then they know who they can go vote for and send in a ballot for them. Because remember, they had everything they need, including the signatures, to get onto that ballot. And we had a bill in California, AB 1921, where this year got passed by the legislature, signed by the governor, which would allow anybody to bring in literally a truckload of vote by mail ballots, drop them off at the election office and say, here, count them. That's where I started to...
Without giving a name or...
There's no information about who's delivering.
Right.
This is just wide open voter coercion, voter fraud, and vote buying. And this is going to be an issue we're going to have to look at more closely, especially people who are working at the local level, finding out who is helping the counties, who's getting paid for by the counties to run their operations. And it could be legit, but Brakey had to put some election officials on the stand in order to get the information out there on the witness stand, in order to find out who's doing this. And they were sort of denying it first. And There's a whole secretive network out there that we don't need to know about. We need to find out about.
Bev Harris has always been right to distrust vote by mail and absentee voting in most places because of the utter lack of controls. And I respect Bev for beating that drum for years. The one thing I can say is that in Michigan, we've had a pretty watertight system. We don't have vote by mail. You have to apply for an absentee ballot every election. There is no automatic anything, and you have to have a signature match. And we have some very good signature matchers who can tell the difference even between a father and son with the same name living at the same address when they got their ballots switched and sent them in each other's envelopes. And we check in at 4 different points. There are a lot of controls, but we would never allow ballots to be delivered by any third party. The ballot has to be delivered by the voter or by the U.S. mail. That's it. You cannot bring in a ballot for other people unless you're a sworn election official.
Changing in California. They're going to, over the next 4 years, allow counties to opt into a system where the counties may send vote by mail ballots to anybody.
That's terrible. You're looking to lose control entirely.
I know. This is part of SB 450. You can read more about that again on my website, countediscuss.org.
Thank you for dogging that.
Vote by mail is existing in Oregon, Washington, Colorado, and it's coming. We're already half of California's vote by mail, and it's going to be. They're going to get almost everybody will get vote by mail ballots, whether they ask for it or not. And the situation is just expanding and getting worse.
Well, and how can that work with the amount of mobility in our society? We've got cities in this state, and I don't think we're nearly as mobile as a lot, where there's a turnover of 20% of the population. Young voters, they're sleeping on a different couch every month. You send a ballot to them, it's never going to reach them, and someone else is going to get it. That's just a terrible system.
Well, we're going to have to figure out how to deal with it because it's growing in popularity, and it's a problem. Let's go back and do a little bit of history here. You said that you got involved in this in 1980. And you were a township trustee, and then something happened. Could you run us through that?
Yeah, I ran for re-election, and we had a very, very hot primary election in a township that's pretty heavily Democratic, and so the big action is in the primary. And we were starting to fight over development and the destruction by development of our beautiful rural natural area. And so the primary was all about that conflict. I lost by 5 votes. Well, late on election day, somebody found 5 ballots with my name on it in a wastebasket at a polling place. So someone had just thrown away 5 votes. I found out at that point, as an innocent do-gooder, that it was very easy for someone to cheat and get away with it. I could not get the state to send anyone down to investigate, depose witnesses, the police, the state police were not prepared. They're not trained in elections. They know guns and they know traffic. And supposedly the state had 4 investigators that they could send, and not a single one of them got there. 2 months later, I said, okay, I'm going to find a lawyer and sue. Well, I couldn't find any attorneys that knew anything. And I realized at that point, we're on an honor system. And when somebody is dishonorable, there's no law enforcement. And that has not changed. We have good laws. They're not enforced. Nobody wants to take responsibility for election laws being enforced. A couple of years ago, Mira met with the state police. We said, something's got to happen. We're not enforcing our election laws. And they said, look, we just can't do this. We're the ones that we always get stuck with the reports because the other police don't want to get involved. It's political, don't you know? And they said, we'd like to work with you to change the whole system so it's moved from the criminal law where nobody wants to deal with it to state civil infractions, the way traffic is handled, where you have a magistrate and they can adjust the punishment to the crime. Well, I think it's a great idea. It would certainly get elections out of competition with murders, sexual assaults, bank robberies, so that we'd have somebody who actually cared about elections. But until we have law enforcement, we're going to have more and more corrupt elections, and just it's very disheartening. And I never did get a recount or anything else in 1980, and that's when I started working on all this.
In California, we were supposed to we were supposed to depend on the county DA to support the election law, enforce the election law. Only you look at it and you say, gee, the county DA is probably buddies with the county registrar of voters. And they're not going to want to go after the county registrars of voters. So we have a gap there. And this idea of the Board of Canvassers sounds like it would be, if it was actually carried out, a much better independent organization to go to have things watched over. Wisconsin used to have that. Karen McKim, if you watched our interview from a couple weeks ago, said that Wisconsin used to have an independent body.
They did. They had a wonderful board that took care of things very well.
To watch over, and that got gutted by the Walker administration.
It was one of the first things they took out.
And I just saw a resignation by one of the Ethics Commission members that I think came out today, because the Ethics Commission took out the wording of wanting to have fair and honest elections. They took the wording out. And so it's just degrading across the country. You've done legislative work. What has been your experience there? The Voting Rights Task Force here in California spends a lot of time in Sacramento. We probably have a better situation than many states. I know we do. But what about Michigan? What have you done? What have you tried to do? What's been your experience in working with the state capitol?
Well, from 2000 to 2010, our legislature steadily deteriorated. One reason was that the voters had stupidly approved term limits. And the result was that after 6 years, a candidate could not run again for the state house, and after 8 years for the state senate. So we churned through all of the experienced people who had been working on these issues, and we'd had good relations with some of them. We'd actually gotten some bills introduced that didn't go very far, but at least they got a hearing in committee. Election day registration. That was one we started with. We thought, well, this will be very popular. The clerks will like it. The voters will like it. It just simply gets rid of a level of bureaucracy we don't need to make people register a month before the election. We no longer have horses and buggies taking records from one place to another. And we almost got that advanced. Well, the sponsor for that bill was term limited. She left. Nobody was left who knew anything or cared or even had an investment. The lobbyists started to run our state. The people who were left in the legislature after the 2010 Tea Party takeover, I can describe them best as these are the Republican frat boys I would not date in college. They're daddy's boys. They're only there because they can't get a job anywhere else. Daddy bought them the election, and they're just there, and they're going to go somewhere else afterward. And they're basically very stupid. They've never had a decent education. They have more money than they know what to do with. They don't know how to be negotiators, politicians, crafters of the future. They don't know how to solve problems. In this state, our legislature has not figured out how to fund our road system.
Yeah.
And that's sick. Roads are nonpartisan. Everybody should be able to decide, okay, we need to have good roads. Otherwise, we can't get industry and we can't get jobs. People can't get to jobs. We don't have our roads being fixed. Nobody in the legislature wants to raise taxes on anything, and they've already given away the money they had to the Class C corporations for giant corporate tax cuts, which, by the way, hasn't helped our job situation at all, but we knew that. So our legislature is really the dumbest bunch of people I've ever seen, and I've lived in Michigan since 1967. They're just the bottom of the barrel. And we have a few shining lights that we've identified who are willing to work with us, and we keep trying. We keep trying to introduce bills. We've got 2 bills that we're going to try again in January, and hopefully we can get some. We actually have bipartisan sponsors because we have some shining lights who really care. And I don't know if the outcry over this recount is going to help us. The legislators that we have from the Tea Party, they're beyond embarrassment. They don't seem to care that we're the laughing stock of the country.
Yeah, what you're describing, by the way, with the term limits is something we've seen in California, and we've seen committee chairs be rookies. Their first year, their first couple of months in office, they're running legislative committees. And I don't want to say they don't know what they're doing. I haven't seen any obvious failures, but you can't go back to the same people who have a history and a knowledge of whatever the topic is and be able to refer to something that happened 5 years ago because they weren't here.
They don't have a clue.
5 years ago. And that's something we've seen in California. They've recently extended the terms so that it's not quite so bad. But I've heard now rumors that the Republican Party is going to try to establish term limits for Congress. That's just something, maybe a 20-year term limit or something would be reasonable, but not.
It's going to take a constitutional amendment. I'm sorry that they're out to lunch on that. So
I'm hearing rumors about this, and Lord knows that they might do this. Do you have, because we also on the Voting Rights Task Force spend a lot of time in Sacramento, do you have any other tips on lobbying the Capitol about how to do it?
Well, it really takes a very concerted strategy. If you can get a bill introduced that's well written, and there's your big challenge, because we had a very detailed proposal for post-election manual audits of the vote based on a risk-limiting model, a statistical model that would allow everyone to agree that after the audit, the chance of a mistake was less than 5%, which is a pretty good confidence level. So getting that translated into actual legislative was very challenging because the people who work in the Legislative Service Bureau, and every state has one, that they're the people that write the bills for the legislators. These people are lawyers. They're not mathematicians. They're not statisticians, and they just didn't understand the concepts. So we had to go about 4 or 5 rounds to get the bill to actually say what our proposal said. We also had a lot of concepts from accounting and auditing that they were not familiar with. For example, an auditor has to be independent of the system that they're auditing. A bank examiner comes in and examines the bank from a completely different agency. And we kept saying, no, these audits are not going to be done by people from the Secretary of State. That would be the fox, auditing the hen house. So it took a long time to get these principles through. And by the way, the principles for good post-election audits are well articulated in a document on electionaudits.org. I was part of the group that wrote those. It took about a year for a lot of us to put that together. And post-election audits, any bill should meet those standards, or it's not going to work. And that's the problem. You have to write legislation that's very clear, that's very detailed. You can't leave anything up to guesswork. And the early writers in our state were very good at this. They did not leave anything to imagination. But lately, these term-limited legislators don't want to put in the work to do that, and they will just say, "Make it so," and they expect, you know, their starship people to figure it out, and they end up with messes. Right now, we're going through what we call the shame duck legislature. It's after the election, and they start getting really crazy, and they'll introduce 12 bills an hour, and these bills are mostly from ALEC, and they're badly written, and they don't fit anything else in the system of the state, and nobody seems to care. And as a result, a lot of these bills get thrown out. I mean, it's like kindergarten. It's terrible. So once you have a really good bill that's very well written, that's very clear, and that's a skill, then you have to get a committee to have a hearing on it. That's a real stretch, because if the committee chair doesn't like your bill, you're never going to see the light of day. So we've had to cultivate the committee chair, she's a Tea Partier, very, very much obedient to the Tea Party hierarchy. She won't do anything they won't tell her to do. And so we've had to figure out how to appeal to things that she cares about. You know, the whole idea of us voting on machines made by foreign countries, their software that we can't even see, that actually did appeal to her, to stop that, to take control over who counts our votes. So sometimes we can find common ground, and that's the struggle right now, is how do you find common ground with people who fundamentally really don't believe in democracy?
Finding common ground. We're talking with Jen BenDor of the Michigan Election Reform Alliance, at the and we've been covering a lot of things about the recounts and the history of elections in Michigan. We just have had another colleague of mine step in, who was last week also in Michigan, Carl Carter. You were out there from the Voting Rights Task Force. Say hi to Jen.
Hi, Jen.
Carl, good to see you again.
Yeah, thank you. Likewise.
Carl, tell us what you saw or didn't see.
Well, it was an eye-opening experience. My background is I'm a tax accountant, so I look at things from somewhat of an accounting background. I'm not really an auditor. I've had many other hats in my life, but when we first were looking at our first group of ballots, the staff were very diligent in counting 401 ballots, and they counted 401 twice. The tape for the election precinct said 402. So we were looking to try to figure out how to reconcile this. And we did find that there was a single damaged or spoiled ballot in a separate envelope, which would have been, by proper procedures, duplicated and put in the pile of the 401. As it turned out, we'd had 4 people looking at these 401 ballots. No one noticed that there was any duplicate ballot in there. So if one was an auditor, one would say, oh, well, here's someone didn't make the duplicate. We could easily see that. We can probably read the intent on the original ballot, and you could either put that into the appropriate Trump or Clinton or Stein column when you're actually counting individual ballots. But the way the state, a corporate attorney, interpreted the state regulations is because the number did not match, and the canvassers were not willing to look again at the 401 ballots, these 401 were thrown out. They would not be recounted. We encountered that same situation later on the second day, And we actually were able to count 2 precincts that had matched the tape. So we felt positive about that. We counted probably close to 2,000 ballots in 3 precincts. And I don't think there was a change on any of the outcome of those 2 precincts. We were allowed to count the actual votes per party. We did notice that there were some significant blank ballots that were troubling to me as we went through this, because some of these precincts were the absentee ballots, and it seemed very unusual that people would trouble to return a ballot, sign the envelope, and not mark a single election or proposition or judge or anyone down ballot. If there was none of the above for the presidency, we could almost understand that. There were a few people who actually wrote none of the above, which spoils the ballot for the presidential, but it doesn't spoil the rest of the ballot. So I think Detroit has 900 and some odd precincts. Jan, you can help me with that. But there would have been 900 separate precinct counts, and then also 900 separate absentee ballot counts. So there's roughly 1,800 separate counts that would have gone on just for the city of Detroit, not even all of Wayne County, I think. So if you have 2 or 3, or in one case we found 6 perfectly blank ballots tucked into that, if you've got 1,800 times 4 or 5, that comes up to close to 8,000 or 9,000 ballots right there that are for some reason returned blank. Now, if
you don't know if they were actually returned by that voter.
That is absolutely correct. And I wish I paid more attention to the AV ballots to see whether or not those blank ballots had any folding marks or whether they were pristine ballots out of a package. And that would have been telling, but I wasn't quite on top of my game, I guess, just to pay attention to everything. We were on another count, we had 3 precincts in one bag that we were given, and we counted the first batch, and we neither matched the machine count nor the book count. And the book count was, I think, 3 lower than the machine count. And I think we were, forget whether we were 1 off from the machine count, but in any case, no, we were 2 ballots. That was it. It was precinct 6. We were 2 ballots short. So the what do you call them? The employee came around and said, well, why don't you put those aside? We will see if the other ballots come up in the other 2, because they're all mixed together in the same bag. So we proceeded to count the next precinct, and we got exactly 721 ballots, which was the tape amount. So that was fine. And then we went through and counted them by candidate, and we got, I think, 1 less for Hillary and 1 more for Trump. So we had 314 in that one and 289 for Hillary. So we had set that aside, and then people decided to go to lunch, which, was about 12:30, 1:45, and that was apparently a no-no, even though it's a secure room and everything should be secure in there, and there are staff wandering around all the time. One of the 51 Trump attorneys came around and challenged the fact that these ballots were not secure, even though they had been set aside by the employees from the county and told us what to do, where to leave them, etc.
They had 51 attorneys?
Yeah, we had 1 attorney representing the Green Party, and 51. It was kind of like,
51 Trump attorneys.
51 Trump attorneys wandering around the room looking for anything that they could possibly put their finger on, create a problem, stop the recount. So we had come back from lunch, and so they had put a challenge in, not for the 1 precinct that was left in the bag that was open. I agree, could be an issue of chain of custody there. That was not totally out of line, but the fact that you've got all these employees around there, that was certainly questionable, but they decided to challenge not the one in the bag, but all three precincts that had been in the bag. So, okay, so they make their challenge, and then we decide to continue counting. Okay, you've made your challenge, we want to finish the job. So we counted the third, because we were still looking for those 2 ballots that were missing from the first group that we counted that we were short. So we counted the third group after the challenge, and we found that it was exactly correct. It was 421, and we found 421, and we tied to the tape, and so we then divided them into candidates, and there was no change. There was no change in the final outcome of the 421. So then the three attorneys who were at our table decided to put their heads together and said, well, we'll drop the challenge. Well, Trump just picked up 2 ballots. Of course they want to drop the challenge. You know, there's no consistency among them. They just thought, if we can win something here, we'll pick it up. What we later found out was this satchel actually had 6 or 7 precincts in it, and the other 3 or 4 were on a table next to us where the people had counted all the ballots. We never knew that they had ballots out of our satchel. We never had any interaction to find out if they found 2 ballots from our precinct, which then would have tied in, and whether or not they had a miscount because they didn't check that it was precinct 6 within 7 or 9 or whatever they were working on. So that was a bit frustrating, and I just gave you an example of the minutia plus the 51 attorneys wandering around trying to create whatever havoc they could. So
it made it very hard to prove. Jen?
I would like to chime in that the bullying and other bad behavior by the Trump volunteers and lawyers was noted in many other recount locations. In Washtenaw County, the Trump people announced right up front that they were going to challenge everything, that their goal was to take up all the time and make the recount impossible to conduct.
Right.
Fortunately, the people who were running that site deftly handled them and said, we will continue with all recount activities. You can file challenges, but they will not be while we are conducting the recount. You'll have to do those on as we proceed. They were running out the clock, and running out the clock is fine in football, but it is not okay in a democratic procedure.
Yep, exactly.
Okay, Jan, speaking of the clock, we're starting to run out. I will leave with a couple of questions and a couple of notes. One, we're talking with Jan BenDor of Michigan Election Reform Alliance.org. Please go to her site, and you have a Facebook page too, I think.
Yes, we do.
You can find them in Facebook and give them all the support you can, because obviously she's doing a fabulous job, and her people are doing a fabulous job, and we need more support for this work because it's going to be across 50 states, each state at a time, and with some luck, occasionally we'll make progress in Washington. We also, I should note, Jan mentioned risk limiting audits, which is the brainchild of Dr. Philip Stark. We interviewed Dr. Stark back in late September. You can find the interview on Ballots for Bernie, or Richard, what's the name of the YouTube page?
California Election Integrity Coalition.
YouTube page, California Election Integrity Coalition, where you can find our weekly interviews on YouTube.
Including this one.
Including, you'll find this one there.
It will be.
This is
on YouTube.
This will be on YouTube
In
in a couple days. And there's an excellent collection of those. These are, in a sense, an extension of the conference that Ballots for Bernie and the Voting Rights Task Force. We held a national conference in Richmond in October, and it was very good. I'm sorry we didn't get you out here, but next time we will do that, because you are obviously one of the guiding lights of the election integrity movement. What would you like to see happen in the future? What are your priorities?
Well, we have priorities for our state, certainly, that are important to those in our organization. And we definitely like to see our state make a rational decision, not a politically driven decision about how we count our votes in the future. One of the things that we included in our 2014 report on facing the election cliff was an appeal for a blue ribbon commission to sit down for 2 years and figure this out with massive public input. And we actually now have a bill for that to happen. Unfortunately, our Secretary of State has not taken our input on this, and they are rolling forward to go out and buy the same old again. The good news is they don't have the money, the $65 million it would cost them. So we're happy that that's holding up what would be a very bad investment. And we've done the math to show that if you actually took that same money, which is only going to buy you machines that will last for 8 years, and the warranties will only go that long. If you took $65 million and you used it to train and pay very highly qualified people to hand count votes on election night, they come in fresh around 10 o'clock, and they actually do the counting in a public process where anyone can observe and witness it. And they will follow a procedure that's been established as highly accurate and reliable. And they come from an outside force. Again, they're counting the votes as auditors would. And we would employ about 20,000 Michigan residents in every election. And we keep the money in the state. It's a jobs program. Yeah. And the $65 million would last for 40 years. That's the bottom line of how we spend our money on elections. Now, we thought some of our conservative people would like that idea. I mean, we have conservatives on our mayor board. We've tried to be multi-partisan. We have libertarians, we have Greens, and so we were trying to appeal to everybody's value system with that argument. But the problem is there are people who are very tied to these companies, and they stand to get rewards from contracting with them. That's what happened in 2003, and we know how that went down. So we're fighting again. This is corruption and cronyism at a high level, but we want to stop the purchase of these machines. They're the same 1970s junk that we